again, friends. It's Kenny Burchard here. I welcome you again to episode number 6 of the MetaStory podcast. This is the podcast that's all about shaping a Christian worldview from the perspective of the big story, the meta-story of the Bible. Now, if you've been a listener for the past several episodes, you'll know that I'm really advocating for a view of the Bible not as a collection of laws or rules or disconnected moralistic stories, and not as a weird book of hidden spiritual truths or archaic religious ideas, or even as a theology book, but rather as a coherent and dramatic meta-narrative, a grand story that is told through a variety of literary genre in order to tell the true story of the world. Well, today we have the honor of being joined by someone who's been a voice among many voices who are directly responsible for helping me and thousands of other people to think about the Bible as one big dramatic narrative. And that person is Tim Day. Now, Tim is presently giving leadership to a new vision in Canada called City Movement. He'll be telling us more about that in this episode, but he's working to help business leaders and parachurch ministries and churches to work together to advance the gospel in their cities. For 15 years before that, Tim served as a senior leader at his church, The Meeting House, which is a multi-city church in central Ontario, Canada. Tim is the author of a great book, which we'll be talking about today, called God Enters Stage Left. This is a creative retelling of God's story. I first read Tim's book in 2013, just after it was published. His relationship with the president of the seminary I attended, along with some of the professors there, motivated him to make this book available to every student in my seminary. So I got a copy of the book. And I'll share more about getting that book and how it helped me to understand the Bible as a meta-story in new and fresh ways as today's episode unfolds. But I just really want to jump in now and introduce you to our special guest. Tim Day, thank you so much for joining me on the MetaStory podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you, Kenny. Yeah, it's great to be here.
I want to tell you that you have, I'll use these words, the distinct honor. You have the distinct honor of being the first ever guest and author interviewed on the podcast. So I do want to say also that you're the first person I ever asked, in case you wondered.
Well, I am feeling honored. I believe this is the second podcast where I was the first one. I was the inaugural guest. So I must have that magic in my DNA there. So fantastic. Thank you for thinking of me, Kenny.
Absolutely. Well, and it really fits with what I'm trying to do here on the podcast, to have you up first. And that's why I said you were the first person that I asked. And there's a good reason for that, which I hope listeners will discern as the discussion unfolds here. So before we talk about your book, I'd like to let listeners hear a bit just about you, your life, your ministry, your family, what you're doing these days, and maybe a little bit about some of the projects that you're involved in that are related to the distribution of your book. So I'll just kind of let you go wild here and give the listeners a bit of a background wherever you want to go.
Okay, well, thank you. And it won't be too wild. I grew up in a small town, very small town in Ontario called Shirkston, and it's like one road. A family lived on the road named Shirks, that type of thing. So quite rural. Did an undergraduate in Pennsylvania, and then did my master's in Toronto. I did a variety of things working. Primarily, I did some work in the general, sort of in general market, but most of my work's been in ministry related contexts. Planted a church, worked at some medium-sized churches, sometimes in youth ministry, but then finally took on the senior pastor role at a church in Toronto area called the Meeting House. And we were a multi-site church that grew from being in a high school to 16 locations, about 5,000 on a weekend.
Wow.
And used a lot of sort of creative arts and technology and stuff to support our community, as we did a lot of, community engagement, supporting international development, but also trying to translate the message of Jesus in ways that were relevant for people living in large urban, suburban centers. So that was a really great experience. From that point now, we've launched into a new initiative after about 14 years at the Meeting House, taking some of those learnings and working at the issue around how do we engage a new generation in major urban centers to live in and share the message of Jesus in a relevant way, because a lot of them are starting to disengage and not feeling like it's relevant or that it's working in the way that it has. And so we're working with church leaders and national organizations to do some fresh imagination and listening, some deep listening, and tackle that project over an extended period of time. So we call it City Movement, and the idea there is that how can Christians in all sectors start to move together in a coordinated way to kind of display the story of Jesus in a way that is inviting and creates intrigue and allows people to join something that's larger, more living, more vibrant than sometimes what people associate with a kind of a more institutional mindset. So that's what we're working on, and that's been really challenging. Now, you asked a good question. What's happening related to the book in all of this? And that is there are a couple things happening right now. One, I can both of them. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I'll say a little bit about it. One of the first people who decided to follow Jesus was of a Muslim background, like the very first person. The first week it was given out. And that led to a connection through, it's ultimately been a network of ministries that work in the Middle East. But they have translated it now into multiple languages and are communicating it through various media streams. And so that continues to unfold. And the amount of response and engagement that we get back, because they use a lot of social media platforms to track engagement, is incredible. So that's one story I would have never guessed at all whatsoever. Then the second one is involved in a project in New York City with a company there that works in the area of transmedia. And they produce what's called story world guides for large narratives that get turned into Hollywood properties. So they've worked with Spider-Man or Pirates of the Caribbean, a variety of things to create these story world guides. So we're actually working on a story world guide for the Bible that could be a resource to people who are doing creative projects on any platform. But it's a way of telling the story to producers so they can tell the story in a fresh way. My family, I'm married, I have 3 kids. My wife, Liz, works with families that have kids with autism. I have a son at university, a daughter who's just finishing up high school, heading to university next year, and then another son that's heading into high school. So living the good old days right now.
Well, that's incredible stuff, and I encourage anyone listening to just be in prayer for you for all of these things, because they're important. I can say, on a personal level, that your work has impacted my life, has greatly encouraged me, has helped me, especially like what you said a minute ago about trying to find ways to help people join the story. And anyone who's a listener to this podcast from the beginning will have heard me say that the biblical story is a story you can join. And so that gets me excited, and hopefully the listeners will discern how that's possible as we move along here. I want to say that I first received your book when I was in seminary several years ago. I went down to check my mail in the student lounge, and we all had our own mailboxes there, and there was just this yellow light emanating from everybody's mailbox because the cover of your book is yellow, so you walk downstairs and you see this yellow kind of peeking out of every mailbox, and I reached in there and pulled it out, and there it was in my hand. God Enters, stage left, with the microphone on it and then the plot twist at the top, and I thought, well, this is interesting. And in our seminary, Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary, which is a Mennonite Brethren tradition, the emphasis there was biblical theology. And for me, systematic theology was kind of the way that I had approached the Bible for so many years before. So seminary was an immersion into the idea of the Bible as this grand story. Mm-hmm. And so, your book actually was instrumental in helping me get my head wrapped around this big idea that we're looking at a big story here. How did it happen that, and maybe you don't know, I don't know if you do, that your book came to be in our mailboxes at my seminary?
Oh, yeah, it's a very simple story. Terry Brensinger, who's the president of Fresno Biblical Seminary, is a good friend, longtime friend. Actually, when I did my undergrad, he was one of my profs, and he was one of the editors of the book. So when it was coming out, I wanted to bless the faculty and the staff. So we just decided to distribute it. And Mark Baker, who's another prof there, decided to use it as one of his course texts later on, I think. I don't know if he still does, but was doing that for a while, and we shipped them books for the students. So it's kind of picked up. Because of the nature of the book, a number of schools are starting to use it as kind of that introductory, the high-level overview of the story. So that's how it came about.
I've been doing, since I started doing this podcast, I've been doing kind of a dialogue experiment with friends, with people in our small group. By the way, you and I, for the listener, we just started talking a couple of weeks ago, so I had no idea you were part of something called Meeting House. And I'm actually also part of something called Meeting House, but they're not related organizations. But it's a small group and a part of a larger network of Meeting House groups. But in our Meeting House group, I also proposed the question that I want to kind of throw at you now because it segues into what the book is about. And I do this with a lot of people. In fact, I did this with some friends at work yesterday. I said, if you're in a coffee shop or you're on a short flight with someone and you told them that you believe in the Bible or that the Bible is an important book to you, and they asked you, what's the Bible about? How would you answer that question? What's the story the Bible's telling, or what's the Bible? Maybe I could ask you to do that here, Tim. What is the Bible? What's it about?
How I'd answer that is I'd say it's really about the question of how does God change the human heart, and so that we can live a different way. And it's a two-part story. The first part of the story is about what doesn't work to change our hearts, and then the second part of what does work. Mm-hmm. And to distill the what doesn't work is attempting to change ourselves from the outside in. In other words, if I put myself in the right environment, I'll be the good person I know I want to be. And that kind of is assumption that, I am a good person and I will be a good person. I just need the right opportunities or the right environment, and then I can live that way. Hmm. And really the story of Israel in the first part is about a group of people who want to experience a new kind of life, but it just doesn't work. And they have the rules, they have the promised land where there's not supposed to be any bad people around, and they're being held accountable, and they have strong leaders, leading them. Mm-hmm. And all these things that we tend to look to just doesn't work. And at the end of it, they're like, God announces that I have to do a new deal, and it's about changing your heart. And that second part of the story, that Jesus enters as God with us, reveals God's very heart to us about how God wants to change us internally. And that comes around internalizing the love of God, so I become a loving person. That my heart has to be transformed, my inner being has to be transformed, so that you can actually put me in a very bad circumstance where I have everything set against me, and I'm still living a life of love and truth that reflects the character and nature of God. And so it's about being changed inside out and outside in. So that's how I describe it, very briefly. And what opens up on being changed in the inside out is not just being able to live this better life, but it opens up the opportunity for me to truly have that close friendship, that close relationship with God, because my heart is like God's heart. And that this provides that deep, satisfying security and intimacy that we all long for. So, in a real quick snapshot, those are kind of the big ideas that I throw out.
Yeah, I really like that, and I like the idea. Every time I do this with someone, I get new pieces, of how they put Scripture together, and I really like what you did there with, differentiating between, the first part of the story, where you have all these external structures that are there, and supposedly they're gonna help people be who they're supposed to be. And of course, the way the story ends in the Old Testament is that didn't work so well. No matter how much external stuff we have, without this internal change, without this way of actually being human in a particular way, there's no way to actually get there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that a lot of the messages in the New Testament are counterintuitive. They're not something that you'll just kind of stumble across. Kind of like you have to die to live. What are you talking about? They're kind of like disturbing our sensibilities. And I think the gift of the Old Testament, or the Old Covenant, the old deal that didn't work, and the new, is the old deal is what's intuitive to us.
Right.
And we have to see what's at the end of that line, where that leads. And I would encourage anybody who's reading this, if you ever read through the entire Old Testament as a story, as a narrative unit, by the end of it, you're just desperate. Please, somebody get me out of this situation I'm in. You know what I mean? Like, can I end this part of the story? Because you just feel labored to the end. But that's really what life is like, I think, for a lot of us. When we're doing what's intuitive, we end up stuck.
When you and I were talking before we started recording, or maybe we were recording, I talked about my approach to the Bible before I went to seminary. And in a previous episode, I had admitted to listeners that I kind of approached the Bible as a book full of theological ideas and a salvation book. This is how you get saved, and then this is what you believe while you're waiting, to go to heaven. That's maybe a caricatured way of talking about how I looked at the Bible, but it's also pretty accurate. And that was kind of my sense of it. And I wasn't taught by the people that were mentoring and discipling and pastoring me to think of the Bible as a grand story. It just wasn't. I can't remember in the first couple of decades of being a Christian, and even after pastoring and teaching the Bible every week, it just didn't click for me. Is this how you were taught to understand the Bible, that it is a grand story, a meta-narrative, a covering, overarching story? Or did you come to this later?
I think my story is a lot like your story in that at first it was, the Bible to me as a young kid was kind of like a random collection of stuff I couldn't make sense of. It's like, I know there's some stories in here and there's some like do's and don'ts stuff and some other stuff that's really hard to understand. And then as you get along, you just kind of assume that this is like, sort of like you say, it's basically a rule book, of what to do. And there's other stuff mixed in, but that's kind of, if you're going to, what to believe and what to do, the manual for living, what to believe and what to do. And I think a lot of that flows from, I was thinking a fair amount about this, that, for example, we have our thinking shaped by the most simple ideas that we kind of put around the big ideas. And for Christians, they put the Apostles' Creed kind of around the Bible,
right.
you know? Like if you distill it down, it comes down to this. But that's really just like a set of beliefs.
Like a doctrinal statement.
Like it's about the metaphysics almost of things, you know? Like it's, I believe in things. But then you think Monday morning, well, what do I do with those beliefs? They're like on a shelf. They're like a plaque on the wall in my life. But I don't know how that impacts what I would actually do. Or be even. How do these things translate in their simplest form? And I got thinking about this, that, you know, Jesus, when he introduced the Sermon on the Mount, he gave the Beatitudes, which in themselves was a progressive story. It was a song, actually. It was a piece of, as a psalm, a retelling of Psalm 1. And it was a song, but it was a song that told a story. It was a song that talked about a way of living, a way of being. And I realized, you know, how would the church be different if we understood it as a story that could be translated into a song that we sing? You know, because I feel like it's like a great love story, or a great, you know, it's like the Lord of the Rings or something, some epic tale. But then you have that song that captures the moment of what this story is all about. And I feel like in some ways, I hope that as we keep progressing and growing, you know, collectively as the church, we can capture more of that original vision of Jesus, of the song, of the story that we're all living and the song that we're all singing. Because I just think it has much more power to shape how we live day in and day out.
It really does. It reminds me of a conversation I had with my son yesterday as he's turning the corner into algebra, and we were talking about abstractions because in algebra you're dealing with lots of abstractions, like X stands for this, or, you know, Y stands for that. And these symbols always stand for something. And I told him, you know, son, theology for me was a lot like algebra for a long time. I was always moving away from the actual toward the abstractions, you know, and trying to create abstractions for every real thing that's in the world. And then boiling down my whole conversation into getting really good at talking about the abstractions. And in algebra, the question is always, but what does the abstraction stand for? So you don't in theology, I think oftentimes we're trying to get really, really good at abstractions, like talking about X and writing books about X and thinking of new ways to understand X as its own thing, you know. I think of some of the words that we use for God: omniscient, omnipotent, you know, omnipresent. Those are all X. They're all abstractions. And in the Bible here you have, you know, this guy Jesus who says, well, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Like, this is as far away from an abstraction as you can get, you know.
Right, yeah. Incarnation is the antithesis to abstraction.
Exactly. And
that's amazing. Do you know what? I got to sit with that one. That's good.
Yeah, I'm still chewing on it.
I'm going to have to quote you on that.
Well, this is part of the journey of dialogue with people who are trying to, as you said, recapture what the book is trying to do. The Bible is not, you know, this is something that's really been important to me, is I'm not trying to dig through the narrative to get to the really good theology, but rather I'm discovering what God wants me to know as the narrative unfolds. The story is telling me, you know, it's not in the way. The story's not in the way. It is the thing. And I think for me personally, I spent a lot of time just trying to get past all that clunky narrative to get to the really good theology, you know. And this is not what the Bible is trying to get us to do.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, I love that. That is amazing.
Yeah, and as I said, you know, in the beginning moments together, your book is part of my own journey to discovering that reality, that this narrative is what we have, and we need to learn how to, you know, walk through it and discover what God's saying in the narrative, not get past or under the narrative, but really get into it. The book, and I have a lot of biblical theology books on my shelf. Yours is included on that particular shelf. It's laid out a little differently from some of the other biblical theology books. Tell us a little bit about the way the book actually flows. Just a quick sort of skim through the overall force of the book.
Yeah, I wanted to tell it as an unfolding story, and so I used, and this has been used by a variety of people, sort of like a play, using the concept of acts and scenes as a play. So that's how I structured the telling of the story again, and because that seemed to make sense to me. And a couple practical things you'll notice is I included in the flow of the story questions to the reader.
Yes.
And that was meant to interrupt them while they're reading and encourage them, try to draw them into personalizing
yes.
what they're reading, so that they weren't just reading it and sitting back, but somewhat being pulled into this is about your life. What do you do? What are you going to do with this idea? And then I added my own reflection chapters that worked with the major scenes and how I wrestled with this, and what I discovered, and what I was trying to put together with my life with it. It really was. I was really in the process of it, trying to be authentic with how my story fit and my processing fit with this story. And I would try to also include some stuff from culture and things like that would be points of connection for most readers, sort of reference points. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of how I structured it. So that as they move through the story at the end, my final invitation was around, very similar to what you're sharing, Kenny. It's an invitation to join the story, enter the story, yes, and start to improvise its themes.
I like that you've embedded the questions for reflection in the text, and it did work for me as I was reading along to pause and think about, what have I just read, and how am I processing this? So it's one of the features of the book that I really, really liked. And I will say there wasn't anything in the book that I didn't like, but there was one section that I liked more than all the rest. And that was the improvised section that you just mentioned. In that chapter, you expand on this theme that you actually touch on throughout the book, and that is that the future in the biblical story is a future without religion. Mm-hmm. So the Bible's not trying to get us to have this perfect religion. It's not guiding us, yes, toward a perfect religion. In fact, at the very beginning of the book, you stress that the original creation, there wasn't religion. And so that you're moving ever onward toward this other way of being that's actually not religious, or it's not religion. And that really came out to me in the improvised section, that this is where everything's headed. So what then, instead of religion, are you proposing?
Well, I'm proposing something that I think is kind of like what we all want, and also what we all are somewhat afraid of. And that is a life of genuine friendship with God. That we, just like I have like my relationship with my kids here at home, each one of them is very unique. They have a different personality, they have different context in life, different things that they love, and my relationship is very adapted to them. Now, we're guided by what is loving and healthy and good for them and for those in their lives around them as the vision for what we want to be all about, But at any moment, that's very case by case, and what may be the loving thing for Rachel may not be the loving thing for Nathan. Yes. They could be very different. But the thing about friendship with God, that's what we all want. It's like, well, that'd be really great that I could be that, free. You know what I mean? That I don't have to follow a wooden set of rules and do's and don'ts, that it can be done in a relationship. So that, I want that. That's what it's, because religion wants to make everything into a ritual, into a systematization. And it's very impersonal. It's a program that you follow. It's not a relationship. But the thing that I realized for me that I'm afraid of, and I think a lot of people are afraid of, is I'm afraid of what God would think if I actually was in relationship with God. And so religion keeps God kind of at a distance.
Yes.
It puts God as the program writer that and as long as I complete the program, I kind of know that I'm going to get a passing grade.
Wow.
Friendship means God's in my life all the time. And that, I think, for a lot of people, there's some pretty big fears there that they have to overcome.
Yeah.
Even though if you say God is love, there's this inherent fear, loss of control, shame. I don't feel like I measure up. And there's a lot of stuff that churns inside of us that we just shy away from, really. If you just say, just sit and be quiet, and we're just going to wait until you have an experience of God being close and talking to you. That's a scary thing for people.
It is. And it's really interesting to this. We probably both experienced this because I pastored in a congregational context for 20 years, and you've been doing that a long time too. And we've both been part of our Christian faith longer than we've been pastoring. But it's interesting to me that Christians take the Bible, which you're presenting it as a book that moves away from religion. Like the trajectory of Scripture, the scriptural story is not toward religion. But it's so interesting to me, because I agree with that all of us who have this Bible are really good at creating religion with it. Mm-hmm. It's just so interesting to me.
Well, I that is one of those things that, it's worth pausing and thinking about. That what is that impulse within us? That it's such a strong default that if we don't make that a primary conversation point on an ongoing basis, we will naturally default to that. And I think there's something about that in our relationships too as well. It's kind of like we default to hating our boss. We default to being angry at the government. There's all sorts of defaults that we have that you have to stop and think, why am I defaulting to this? Why do I want, and I think there's some deeper questions about our lives that, that can be quite personal to my own life that I can sit and think about. But I do think that is something that among Christian leaders, there is a lot of work to be done to stare that one down a bit. Because I do think we find 1,001 ways. It might be a religion that's very experiential, almost on the magical end. It could be very legalistic. It could be very social action oriented. It could be very theological and intellectual. But we all have ways, various forms that we create this systematization that turns it into a program and really robs it of a true, kind of like just a true, humble, authentic living in relationship with God and allowing God to treat each other differently.
Imagine, if you can, that you are sitting across the table from someone. They may have been a believer a long time. Maybe they're not a believer at all. Whatever the case is, they're sitting there with a Bible in front of them, and they wanted to see you. And they say to you, Tim, I'm about to get into this book like I've never gotten into it before. Mm-hmm. And I'm getting serious about this book. And before I jump in, Pastor Tim, do you have any advice for me? Like, what should I do? How should I go at this book? And you've got a few minutes to, I talk about trajectory, to set the trajectory, because whichever direction they're facing, if they've got that much energy, they're going to go all the way. So you get to set the trajectory in this person's decision to get serious about the Bible, either for the first time or maybe in a whole new way. What would you say to that person?
First thing I would say to them is Star Wars.
Okay.
Start at New Hope. Don't start at Episode 1. And what I mean by that is, if you know the Star Wars trilogy, George Lucas did Episode 4 first.
Yep.
And I'd say the same thing. Jump ahead to Jesus.
Yes.
And spend the first while in the stories of Jesus' life. Just soak in who Jesus is first. And then move on with some of the other New Testament letters about Jesus' life. The book of Acts, the book of Romans, those first couple ones that follow are good ones just to kind of soak in. The second thing I would say is find a friend to talk it out with, somebody who you look at and you say, this person really, when I picture if you have some concept of who Jesus is, or the most loving person you can imagine, not someone who is the most religious person you can find.
Right.
I'm not saying that.
Right.
I'm talking about the person who's the most loving.
Yes.
Who seems to radiates a relationship with God, a love of God, and a kindness towards people that follows Jesus. I'm like, hang out with them, process your questions with them, see what they're struggling with, what they've learned, what they've observed, and allow them to be on the journey with you. Because you not only want to read the story, but wouldn't it be cool? It's like this. This is what I'd say. Wouldn't it be cool if you could watch Star Wars and then hang out with a Jedi? You know what I mean?
Yes.
It would totally
Love
change because you would be asking the Jedi, so who is Snoke, right?
Yes.
These types of things or whatever. So I'm like, I think there's a real value in someone who's living the story, who you can see that person is like really changed, and I'm really drawn to them. And then, with Jesus, who is really the one God gave us to help us really understand what life in friendship with God was really meant to be like.
Star Wars and a friend. I love it.
That's it. Yeah. Yoda. Find a good Yoda.
Exactly. Let's as we wrap up here, give the listeners access to your website. You mentioned your commentary. There's some great devotional material there. I've read several chapters of your commentary online, and I really love it. So point us to those resources.
Okay, great. timday.org is you can check out some resources there. I both have some questions if you're going to do your own personal study or if you're going to do it in a book club. There's a number of people who, let's say, will do a book club at their work, and one was like a lawyer in media, not from a Christian background at all. They just liked the book and they did it as a book club. So some of the questions are just meant for people in the general market, sort of tearing this apart as a book, and then some are for those that are more in a Christian Bible study setting and they want to study it, through the lens of the Bible. So there's some questions there. My commentary's there, and you can also contact me there on the website if you have any questions, or find me on social media, Tim Day.
Well, that is where we have to end today. My thanks to Tim Day for joining me. Be sure to pick up Tim's great book, God Enters Stage Left. You can get a hard copy or a Kindle version over at Amazon.com. And as you read it, my prayer for you is that you'll grow in your own appreciation for the Bible as a dramatic story, a meta-story, the true story of the world. And I encourage you to head over to timday.org and learn more about Tim's ministry. Check out his great devotional commentary through the whole Bible. Be sure also to stop by the website at metastory.org for more content and past episodes, and a growing companion blog. I'm adding more content there as the weeks roll on. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Kenny Burchard. As always, my thanks to you for spending this time with me. Until we're together again, God bless.